The world looks to California to answer the hard questions, for redemption, to introduce the unfamiliar, to be resilient. Because California bounces back, holds us accountable, values who we are, remains vigilant, defies those in our way, and stands for community. Here on the West Coast, we're at the center of it all. Los Angeles Times, the state of what's next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Donna Wares, editor of the LA Times Book Club. So let's face it, we're all going stir crazy with this pandemic. And the craziest part is that we're escaping from the current reality with a doomsday novel about a flu pandemic that is sweeping the globe. Tonight, author Emily St. John Mandel joins us to talk about her mega best-selling novel, Station 11. And I'd like to invite our book club readers at home to share their questions this evening throughout the conversation. We're going to meet Emily in just a moment, but first, I'd like to take you inside her world.
Emily St. John Mandel's novel, Station 11, shows us a world that survives a global pandemic, but just barely. There are no cities, no countries, no internet, no more Facebook, no more cell phones. 20 years after the devastation of the Georgia flu, we meet the Traveling Symphony, a Shakespearean troupe of actors and musicians who bring their art and humanity to the Earth's remaining settlements. The housewives of Orange County are long gone. King Lear is in demand in this futuristic world. The Traveling Symphony's lead caravan is emblazoned with the credo, because survival is insufficient, a line curiously lifted from the character Seven of Nine in the TV series Star Trek Voyager. While researching the book, Mandel says she came to understand that pandemics are an inevitability in our history. This is not to minimize the horror or the tragedy in any way, she says, but this is just something that happens every so often. It's happened before, and it'll happen again. Still, she says in a March interview with The Times, I would not recommend reading Station 11 in the middle of a pandemic. Yet Station 11, like other best-selling apocalyptic fiction, has struck a deep chord with readers hunkered down at home during a real-life pandemic. Author and former Times book editor David Hewlin says he understands why.
First of all, people are always kind of interested in gravitating towards apocalyptic fiction because it's one of our shared kind of nightmares about the outcome of the species and the outcome of history. Reading is a shared experience, and literature is a way for us to communicate with each other and sort of not necessarily transmit information, but to share the stories of what we're going through and to have a kind of common experience. And I think particularly in a moment like this where our common experience is to be isolated, it's a way for us to reach out and connect to each other emotionally at a time where we can't really reach out or connect to each other in other ways.
Mandel published Station 11 to critical acclaim in 2014. It won the Arthur C. Clarke Award, became a National Book Award finalist, and has sold more than 1 million copies. The book is in production for an HBO Max series being shot in Chicago. Mandel also is the author of 4 other novels: The Lola Quartet, The Singer's Gun, Last Night in Montreal, and The Glass Hotel, her new bestseller, which tackles another timely topic, a financial crisis. Emily St. John Mandel was born and raised on the west coast of British Columbia, Canada, and studied contemporary dance at the School of Toronto Dance Theatre. She lived briefly in Montreal before moving to New York, where she now lives with her husband and young daughter. While starting to write novels, she held a day job as an administrative assistant. People are often surprised when I tell them that I have no MFA, no college degree, and no high school diploma, she says. It's a long, boring story involving homeschooling and questionable life choices. Tonight, Mandel will be in conversation with Times arts writer Carolina Miranda. Please welcome Emily St. John Mandel and Carolina Miranda to the LA Times Book Club's virtual stage.
Thank you, Emily, for joining us this evening. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have you, and welcome back. We always love having Carolina with the LA Times Book Club. Welcome back, Carolina.
How are you?
I'm doing great. And we've really been enjoying your book, which has made, well, your books, but Station 11 particularly has made an interesting experience to read at this time. I know that you're in New York right now. And I'm just curious, how are you doing? And also, how does the fictional pandemic compare with the real life situation you're living through right now?
I'm doing fine. Thank you for asking. I'm feeling very lucky to live in a house with some outdoor space, which is not the case with all of my neighbors. So, it's incredible to be able to go outside and not have to go out in public to do that when you're living at the epicenter of something like this. Yeah, we're all in good health. Getting work done with a 4-year-old at home is a challenge, but I'm not alone in that. So I'm doing fine. In terms of how the fictional pandemic compares to the real one, I have to say there were some things I just didn't anticipate. I think that in all my research, I sort of thought about pandemics as being kind of a binary situation, like you're either in a pandemic or not in a pandemic. But so much of the experience of early March in New York was of this kind of creeping dread where we were sort of in a pandemic, and then I'm not quite sure if we were in a pandemic. Then it became clear there wasn't enough testing. And yeah, that kind of, that interlude where we knew it was coming, but we were kind of in denial and still sent our kids to school. That's something that I didn't anticipate. I will say, though, the pandemic in the book is vastly worse than the pandemic in real life, which is not to minimize the awfulness of our current moment in any way. But I suppose there's some comfort in that.
Well, Carolina is a culture writer here at the Times, and I wanted to take just a moment to talk about how your job and your role with the stories that you write have changed in the last 2 months. What's your life like for you now?
Well, I usually work from home, so that aspect of things has not changed for me. I think on the art side of writing, museums and galleries have shut down. And so there are not those stories to tell, but there are still many institutional stories to tell about how these places have been affected by the pandemic, how they're facing it financially, and also in terms of bringing community together. I mean, what do people do in this time but turn to art to kind of serve as a salve? And then on the architecture side, really thinking about, Emily brought up the point, like how great is it to have some outdoor space in the middle of a pandemic? I'm also lucky enough to have outdoor space. And so thinking about how we think about the future of design as we think about pandemics. So lots of food for thought and getting a lot of housework done.
Well, it's thrilling to have both of you together. And at this point, I'd like to turn the conversation over to you, Carolina, and I'll join you a little bit later with some reader questions. But first, I just wanted to remind our readers, if you have questions that come up during the conversation, please send them to us. bookclub@latimes.com, or you can leave them on Facebook. And the other note is that our book selling partner this evening is Vroman's Bookstore, which has special signed books available, a limited number just for this event. So now I'm turning it over to Carolina, and I'll join you a little later. Thanks.
Thanks, Donna. Well, I am super excited to be here. I have to say, you've provided me with some really amazing reading during this time. I am one of those people that likes to read about pandemics in a pandemic. I've also watched a lot of pandemic movies. Like, I am into kind of absorbing how it's portrayed, and have assiduously stickied all of your books. And, I wanted to start, we're going to talk about The Glass House in a minute, which is the new book, but I did want to start with Station 11 because it is a book about a flu that pretty much destroys society. And you had mentioned this kind of state of disbelief that happens of is this pandemic happening? And then it only gradually sinking in that it is happening. And there's this great line in the book that I wanted to read, where you write, Jivan was crushed by a sudden certainty that this was it, and that this illness Wa was describing was going to be the divide between a before and an after. So this moment of realization. And so I'd love to understand from you a little bit about the psychology of pandemics. Like, what were you seeking to capture in terms of, I guess, how our slightly unimaginative minds deal with these kind of crazy abstract moments?
Yeah. I was just kind of imagining what I thought it would be like, to get news like that, as Jeevan does in the book, that phone call from his friend that basically says it's the end of the world. Like, you need to get out of town or get supplies and hunker down somewhere. There is this weird psychology of disbelief. But something I've been thinking about is the way we're all going to be changed by our current experience. I find myself a little bit haunted by, as I mentioned, the early part of March, when we knew what was coming. And yet we weren't really stocking up in any serious way because it just seemed so unbelievable. And what I've been thinking lately is that the next time we get news of whatever approaching thing, I think we're going to move really fast and take it seriously and have enough Lysol wipes. So, it's maybe you only need one of these unbelievable events in your life to be a little on edge for the rest of it.
Yeah, I know. Who knew that antibacterial, antibac would be like the gold of our current pandemic society. What research did you do into pandemics? I was really struck by a moment in the book where you talk about like Midsummer Night's Dream. Shakespeare, the traveling troupe does a lot of Shakespeare, and that it was a play written in 1594, the year London's theaters reopened after 2 seasons of plague. And so I was really struck by that and wanted to know sort of what did you look to in sort of thinking about creating this world?
Right. So something, a sort of reassuring PSA I'd like to put out about Station 11 is that it's not particularly scientifically plausible. In real life, a flu that killed that many people that quickly would really burn itself out before it could infect very many people. But so I was very aware that it was an extremely fictional flu as I was writing it. But I wanted to know more about just the mechanisms of mass contagion and, some of the history there. So I started reading about the history of pandemics. I found myself focusing mostly on the smallpox pandemic in the Americas in the 1790s. And I think I was drawn to that one because the accounts I was reading about it were often from around the area where I grew up. I'm from southwestern British Columbia and Vancouver Island, and then one of the northern Gulf Islands. And there's this one story in particular that I find a little bit haunting, where it was the spring of 1792. Captain George Vancouver was sailing north up the coast around what's now Seattle and then northward into what's now British Columbia. And as they traveled northward, he and his crew found themselves increasingly unsettled because here they were in this rich, temperate place. It is so green there. It's never very hot or very cold. Seemed like the kind of place that should have had a lot of people, but it was strangely empty. And then when they finally did venture ashore, they found villages that could have housed hundreds of people, but those villages were abandoned. And then they ventured further and they began finding human skeletons on the beaches. And when they did eventually encounter the very few people who remained of the native population in that area, those people had terrible stories and terrible scars because smallpox had already gone through. So you read a story like that, and what you realize pretty quickly is that if you write a novel about a pandemic that knocks out a civilization, that's really a fictionalization of a non-fictional setup. That is something that's happened on one scale or another throughout human history. So that was kind of fascinating and unsettling. And then, another part of my research was, of course, trying to figure out what the symphony's repertoire was going to be. And it began to seem to me that it might be appropriate for it to be a Shakespearean company, partly because of some parallels that I was seeing between this post-technological world that I was writing about and the world of Elizabethan England, Shakespeare's world. The most obvious being that in Shakespeare's time, theater was so often a matter of these small traveling companies setting out on the road, moving from town to town. And I think I was drawn to the parallel there, the idea of a world in which such a company might again set out, the age of electricity having come and gone. But then, as you just alluded to, there was also the plague, which was very related to that situation of traveling companies, because the plague there'd be an outbreak of plague. The theaters in London would close because it was too dangerous to congregate, and the companies would then set out on the road. And it just began to seem to me that Shakespeare's life and work, and probably, probably more broadly speaking, the life and psychology of his country would have been so profoundly shaped by those episodes of bubonic plague. So, yeah, it was an interesting experience to be writing a book set in the future and find such a clear, interesting parallel to the past.
It's interesting that, the whole discussion of the plague, one of the books, first books I read when the pandemic started was this book by Philip Ziegler called The Black Death, that was about the Black Death in Europe. And it talked about, he has this one section in the book, he kind of goes country by country. It's not the most fascinating narrative read. He takes you sort of how the Black Death spread around Europe. But one of the things he describes so well at one point is how the plague would often affect the psychology of the places that it traveled through in this way that was just indelible. Like people for decades after surviving this incident would be kind of nervous about other incidents. They'd be a little paranoid. What you said earlier about that maybe the next time we get about a warning about something, we're all going to run out and stock up. And so thinking about that parallel to this, and then the way it's reflected in your book is just really fascinating, because also what we're seeing in your book is not just the moment the pandemic hits, it's this 2-decade.
Right. It's the far aftermath. Yeah, that question of the psychological impact is something I've been thinking about a lot. Because, something that I've definitely been guilty of in my life is when I'll be say older people who I've been close to, my grandparents, people with vivid memories of the Depression, they would save little bits of string and tinfoil, just in case of some kind of terrible economic downfall and like incredible shortage of essentials. And I kind of understood, but kind of rolled my eyes, like, you can just buy more string. But I wonder
Yeah.
what our string will be, if our grandchildren will be like, why do you need an entire room full of toilet paper and Lysol wipes? So that's a little insane. It will be like, you don't understand how quickly those things disappear. So yeah, it's an interesting question.
You're like, I am hoarding. It's interesting. As a Californian, I have an earthquake kit, but I just hadn't thought to stuff it full of like antibacterial wipes. I have it full of many other things, but not antibac or hand sanitizer. How is there any aspect of the way you portrayed the psychology of this plague in the book that now living through this experience you might want to do differently if you had to do it over again?
Right. One thing about this book is we spend so little time in the actual plague. You alluded to the timeline a moment ago, and that was a very conscious choice. I kind of wanted to get through the end of the world pretty quickly and look at the world that comes next, just because I wasn't that interested in writing a horror novel. There are absolutely things I would do differently, though. If I were writing this book now, there would be that kind of prelude of disbelief, which just hadn't occurred to me before living through it. Another thing, which I don't think is something I got wrong in the book, I think it's a function of the way the world's changed since I wrote it. When I wrote this book, it would have been, 2008 through 2011-ish, or 2010 through, somewhere, around there. That was a very different political landscape, particularly with regards to how we trust the news, versus now, where there's a scene in the book where characters get off an airplane and congregate in this airport, and they're all gathered around monitors tuned to CNN, which is reporting dire news, and everybody believes it, which is not believable for a book in the present moment where half of the people standing there would be dismissing it as, some kind of insane conspiracy by the other side. But that was plausible back in 2009 when we had a greater, I would say, a greater framework of consensual reality, before we were quite so partisan in the way we consume the news. So that's something that would definitely be different if I were writing the book today.
That's interesting. That's something that in a way echoes the Black Death, in which oftentimes, people without the scientific knowledge of how the plague was transmitted would do things like blame witches.
Right, or not wear masks.
Yeah, there was huge anti-Semitic purges during the era of the Black Death in Europe. And so thinking about, in some ways, our era resembles that era more than maybe it does a more recent.
That's depressing, isn't it? We've gone back to the 1300s.
Exactly. Yay, Middle Ages. Medieval period.
Right.
I could talk about Station 11 forever, but you have a new book that is also about a collapse of sorts, but like a very different ones. The story is loosely based on a corporate Ponzi scheme led by a character called Jonathan Alkaitis.
That's right. Yeah.
Which bears a lot of parallels to, and I was living in New York at the time when this happened, the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme for which he was convicted in 2009. And you tell the story. It's such a fascinating way of telling this tale, because you're really telling the story in many ways from the characters who ring him, not just him and his actions, but the people he affects and the people who surround him. And so I was curious to know, like, why Ponzi schemes and financial collapse as a novel, and also why tell the story in this way through all of these lenses around him?
It's a good question. I was fascinated by Bernie Madoff's crime, which for anybody who wasn't obsessively following the news in 2008, 2009, that was a $65 billion with a B dollar Ponzi scheme that collapsed in New York at the height of the last economic collapse. none of the characters in this book are real. So I like to just emphasize that it's not actually a novel about Madoff or his actual investors or actual family or anybody who was actually around him. But the central crime is based on Madoff's crime. I was fascinated by the scale of it. And what particularly fascinated me is that Madoff had a staff. See, I think not a lot of people know this, but if you're a billionaire, you're not sitting down and formatting all those fake account statements by yourself. You got people for that. So at the time the story broke, I had a really great day job for a writer. I was a part-time administrative assistant in a cancer research lab at the Rockefeller University in New York. And I really liked my coworkers. And what I found myself thinking about was just the camaraderie that you have with any group of people who work together all the time, the sense of shared mission. Now, imagine how much crazier and more intense that is if you're showing up at work on Monday to perpetuate a massive crime. I mean, it's kind of mind blowing. So that was my entry into the story. The beginning of my fascination with it was just this thought of, who are these people? What kind of stories do you have to tell yourself to make it possible to go to work on Monday and possible to sleep at night? How do you convince yourself that what you're doing is somehow okay? And it seemed to me that there were these kind of parallel tracks of self-delusion in that sense. There were the staffers who must have had some narrative that made it possible to sleep at night. On the other hand, there were the investors. A lot of investors had no idea they were investing with Madoff. They'd invested with a fund that was invested in a fund. But there were a lot of direct investors who knew where their money was and, thought they knew where their money was and, were getting those account statements. One of those people was quite close to me. He's in my family. And what he says about that time is that he would look at the account statements. They never made sense. He could never figure out where the money was, where the numbers were coming from. But the returns were so good. So it was just this kind of collective shrug, like, well, I guess if anything were amiss, then surely somebody else would have caught it. So yeah, there was just a lot of interesting psychology there. And in terms of why I told the story the way I did, the truth is I never found Madoff interesting. If you read prison interviews with him, he comes across as just such a garden variety narcissist. Like, he's just not a very interesting person, in my very unkind opinion, but there it is. I did find myself more interested in the people on the periphery, the staffers who I just mentioned, the investors. Once you start writing a novel about a Ponzi scheme, which was originally going to be the only focus of this book, you're kind of automatically writing about money as a topic. So I always did have that character of the trophy wife. That's a phenomenon that kind of interests me. So yeah, those were just the most interesting people to me, the most interesting lens to kind of look at different angles into this crime.
And she's a very interesting trophy wife in the sense that she doesn't fit the central casting idea of trophy wife. Like, this is someone who's very sharp and comes from, and just like you inverted the stereotype about what a trophy wife is with the character of Vincent. And why were you tell us a little bit about where she came from?
Yeah, sure. I had her in mind as a character from the very beginning. I always knew that the criminal in the story, Jonathan Alcaides, that he would have this much younger wife, or kind of wife figure. They're not actually married. I find that we have these really kind of strange ideas around women and beauty, that if you're incredibly beautiful, then probably you're not that intelligent, and vice versa. And, there was just something really interesting to me about having a character who did subvert that, as you mentioned, who is very sharp. She's very undereducated, but, self-education is important, and it's something she pursues. So yeah, I think I just found myself drawn to this character because I hadn't really seen her that much before. You don't see a lot of genius trophy wives in popular depictions.
Yeah, there's something a little dark about her that I appreciated, because the stereotype is the kind of vacant pretty.
Right.
I'm into shopping kind of things, but Vincent is a very different, like there's like this still pool that runs very deep that makes her such a complaint. You mentioned that this is a book ultimately about money, and part of what really intrigued me was this intersecting of worlds. The what you describe as the kingdom of money. The sort of environment, the milieu in which the wealthy live, and then the shadow country, quote, of the poor and working class. And there are these moments in the novel where these different worlds intersect. And I think there's this really remarkable parallel. Towards the beginning of the novel, there's a scene in which a staff member of Al-Qaeda's household is a housekeeper, is serving him coffee, and he doesn't even notice her. Like he's just used to having coffee delivered. She doesn't exist. And then towards the end of the novel, there's another scene in which it's clear that the end is upon him. He knows that the femme have caught on to his Ponzi scheme, and he and the receptionist comes in and serves coffee, and immediately everybody in the room freezes up. And it's these two moments in which these worlds intersect, and so I'd love to hear from you a little bit about why are you interested in those overlaps, I guess, in real life, but also for the purpose of this book.
It's a topic I find really interesting. I was raised in a very working class environment. And to be clear, I have no complaints. I have wonderful parents, and it was a really great upbringing in a lot of ways. But there really was no money. And at this point in my life, as a novelist, the people who I meet are overwhelmingly people who grew up middle class or upper middle class or with a lot of money. And it seems to me that there's a profound cultural difference between people who grew up with a financial safety net versus without. And I don't mean that in any kind of derogatory way. A lot of my favorite people have always been very financially comfortable. But it feels like a cultural difference that's so profound that, sometimes when I'm talking to someone who grew up very differently than I did, there is almost a feeling of talking to someone from another country, in a way that has nothing to do with the US-Canada border. So I do find those cultural differences really interesting. And yeah, this idea that money is its own country, that's just something I've been thinking about. Back in the lost world, when we got on airplanes, which is to say last October, I came out to Los Angeles a couple of times for a TV project I've been involved with. And I have really a crazy number of miles on Delta because I did an endless tour for Station 11. So a couple of times I used miles to upgrade to Delta One, so first class, to get home from Los Angeles to New York. And what that experience looked like in practical terms was, I'd get on the plane at LAX at 10:30 at night. I'd recline my seat to 180 degrees and pull up a soft comforter, take a very pleasant nap, and then wake up refreshed in New York City in the morning. And it was like that experience was so frictionless that it almost rendered the distance unconvincing. Like I remember having this sort of irrational thought that, there's no way those are two different cities. Like, come on, that was like one very comfortable experience. And kind of extrapolating that out, I kind of imagine that having an incredible amount of money would be just a higher degree of that, really just a very separate existence that would be like living in a different country for all intents and purposes. And then the shadow country, we've all seen it. The way we sort of agree not to look at or pay very much attention to the tents under the expressways, or in New York City, the people who are collecting bottles to turn them in for, the bottle deposits, walking slowly down the sidewalk with these huge bags of bottles and cans. And the way we just kind of glide around them without really acknowledging them, there's a kind of horrible invisibility there. And yeah, and they seem to me to live in the kind of inverse of the kingdom of money. This country that we try not to look at too closely because it scares us. We know that could be us.
And it's really interesting because I feel like it's a moment, you know, going back to the topic of pandemics, that has been just rendered, you know, you see it in the news every day. Who can work from home, who has to go to work, who's at risk of contagion, who is not at risk of contagion, who's getting the tests and who's not getting the tests, and these moments in which those worlds overlap. And you know, that is such an interesting undercurrent of this book. You know, Vincent comes from a background that is working, and so it's really interesting to think about. Her observations are very interesting about this kind of world that she has come to inhabit.
Thank you.
So I wanted to, one of the other things in the book that I was really interested about is this idea you call the counter life, which is this idea of basically the path not taken. Like, what if I had married that guy? What if I had gotten on that plane? What if I had said yes to that job? How would my life be different? And I think what's interesting about discussing these two books together is that, you know, they're overlapping characters, and to some degree the books serve as a counter life to each other. But you also have these characters that are sometimes like obsessively inhabiting these counter lives to the point where reality is not always clear. And so I was really interested in that idea of like the narrative, and then the narrative that might have been, and what intrigued you about sort of telling the story that didn't happen.
Right. Yeah, the counter life, your counterfactual life, the life where you married somebody else or went to a different school or stayed in Canada instead of moving to New York when you were 22, like whatever it was. That is an idea that's always interested me. And at first in this book, I was thinking of the idea partly an homage to Philip Roth, who I find a little bit hit or miss. He's by no means a lodestar for me, but his novel, The Counter Life, I thought was pretty remarkable, made a big impression on me. And it was a sort of series of variations on a life, you know, the way things might have gone differently. So I was trying to put myself in the position of Jonathan Alcaides, who, because the crime is based on Madoff, I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say that he's sentenced to 160 years in a federal prison. I think if I were in that position, I would spend a lot of time not in prison, you know, trying to imagine a sort of a counter life. You know, so he spends a lot of time in these, what seem at first like daydreams of a life where he fled to Dubai, which has no extradition treaty with the United States. But then as the book passes, it becomes less and less clear that those are just daydreams. You know, they become so vivid that he actually starts to have serious doubts about which life is real. When I started writing this book, I was thinking of it as a crime story. It was going to be so closely centered around this Ponzi scheme. But I don't write from an outline. And that means that sometimes my novels go in some really unexpected directions. So that happened here. And by the time I'd finished it, it was kind of a ghost story with a Ponzi scheme in it. It's a really hard book to try to describe to people. But, you know, once I realized that there was going to be this whole ghost story element, I found it kind of interesting to think about different ways of being haunted. Because when we use that phrase, ghost story, we tend to think of it, I think, in kind of classical terms. You know, you're imagining that figure wafting, you know, down the hallway in this dilapidated Victorian mansion or whatever. But consider the possibility that your life is haunted by the ghosts of the lives you didn't live. I kind of love that idea. So to a large extent, I was thinking of the counter life in terms of that idea of hauntedness.
You mentioned the fact that you don't write outlines, which is a perfect segue to my next question, because your novels are not linear; they jump forward and back, and sometimes you'll be moving along in a chapter, and then a single sentence plunges you years, or weeks, or months, or years into the future. And as a reader, it's so fascinating because you're kind of cruising along in a particular narrative, and then all of a sudden this sentence drops in that takes you 20 years into the future. And I've almost come to think of them as I call them Emily bombs. Like all of a sudden,
Love that. I'm going to use that.
You're just like, oh my God, I'm in a different time. And then it completely shifts the meaning of the story, because you kind of know what's going to happen, but you're like, whoa, how's he going to get there? And I just wanted, without giving away anything, I wanted to read some of my favorite. They're just these like one sentence things that she drops into a chapter, and they just like rattle you to your core.
You're going to read the bartender one, are you?
Yes. I have a few. I'm not saying what books they are, just in case people here haven't read any of the books. So of all of them at the bar that night, the bartender was the one who survived the longest. It's like,
yeah. There's such manipulation, if we're being honest here, in writing a novel, because at every point I am thinking in terms of how do I keep the reader reading? And, sometimes I do just drop something in like that. And what I'm hoping is that, perhaps you've been a little bit complacent in the first 5 chapters, whatever it is. And then you read a sentence like that. It's like, wait, what? I need to keep reading and find out what happened. Yeah, because that sentence goes on to say he died 3 weeks later. So obviously something cataclysmic is about to occur. So yeah, that is purely manipulative plotting.
Yeah, there's another great one I loved. This was during the final month of the era when it was possible to press a series of buttons on a telephone and speak with someone on the far side of the earth. So this idea of like,
something's about to happen there. Yeah,
technology has ceased. So how do you do this when you don't write outlines? I guess that's what I want to know. How do you put me so many months or weeks or months or years in the future without having an outline in front of you? Like literally, where do you start? And then how do you go in and weave these kind of flash forwards that you do?
Years of revision is the unglamorous answer there. So my process is I'll just start writing. I'll write a scene and I'll see what that turns into. It turns into a chapter. I've got the beginnings of a story. I'm starting to get some ideas about characters. And I just kind of keep going like that. I jump all over the place because I don't know where I'm going. So I get stuck all the time. And then with Station 11, it was about a year. With the Glass Hotel, more like 2 years. After a period of time, I'll have an unbelievably messy first draft. I mean, there is nothing coherent about my first drafts. And then I just go over it over and over and over again. And that's where anything coherent or halfway clever kind of comes up, So that sentence with the bartender, for example, would absolutely not have been there when I wrote the book, when I wrote the first draft. But I go over the manuscript over and over and over again for years in all kinds of different ways, trying to trick myself into seeing it differently. And along the ways, I just begin to find more and more connections. And I just get more ideas about how to create more tension, how to create the Emily bomb, as you call it, which I love.
I love it. No, I think of them very affectionately. How do you start with a character? Do you start with a scene? Like, for example, what did you start with when you started the Glass Hotel?
The Glass Hotel, I started with the Ponzi staffers, which after really a crazy number of revisions ended up being chapter 10. But the first part of the book I ever wrote was, chapter 10. It's the introduction to the Ponzi staffers told in a plural voice. So it begins, we had crossed a line. And that was where it started. But then I also had the hotel pretty early on. So, I would say those were the 2 starting points.
Yeah, the hotel is an interesting character. I've done a lot of travel writing, and there's a great description of this hotel in this part of British Columbia, really a luxury hotel geared at people who want to see nature but not really be in.
Right.
And I thought
which
that
is
was
most of us, and that's fine.
I like a little bit of both.
Yeah.
Speaking of British Columbia, I feel like that is not a part of Canada I've been to, so you will have to forgive my ignorance about it. But it plays interesting roles in both books. In the Glass Hotel, more prominently, there's a big chunk of the novel that is set there at this hotel, and also in the youth of some of the characters. In Station 11, our Shakespearean actor is from an island near Vancouver, and the woman he ends up marrying is from there too. And there's this understanding that there's this psychology that's understood, and that's why they get together. And so, I wanted to understand from you of like what makes this part of the world such an interesting character, I guess, that you want to include it in your books.
It's partly just that I know it so well. There are a lot of risks in setting substantial parts of a narrative in a place that you don't know really well, because you will get 300 emails from readers saying, Ms. Mandel, I'm not sure if you realize there never was a candy store on Main Street in town X in 1965. And you're like, oh my God, why didn't I make it a fictional town? To avoid those moments, I either make it a fictional place or I set it in a place that I know really well. So that's why my books are set in British Columbia, Toronto, Montreal, and New York. Those are the places I've lived.
But there's something about the texture that you give British Columbia that there's something a little that feels a little enchanted about it.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's me reading into it or
no, not at all. That there is something enchanted about it for me. Partly maybe because maybe you're always a little bit enchanted by the location of your childhood memories. That might be part of it. There was also, you just mentioned the little island in Station 11 where Arthur and Miranda are from. And I only barely fictionalized that island. I call it Delano Island. In real life, that's Denman Island, British Columbia, and you can visit, and it's gorgeous. That's where I grew up from when I was 10 to 18. I have to say the description of it in Station 11 is completely autobiographical. Now, there's a moment when Arthur is asked about it. Someone says to him, "Oh, it sounds beautiful." And his kind of rumination on it is, yes, it was. It was beautiful and claustrophobic. It was the most beautiful place I've ever seen. I loved it, and I always wanted to escape. And that was my relationship with that island. So, although I've never been that interested in autobiography or autofiction or memoir or anything that close, elements of my life do inevitably get into the fiction. So, yeah, I wanted to write about that. And for Arthur and Miranda, I wanted to write about an experience that I had when I was 18. If you grow up in a really tiny place and then you move to a city like Toronto, 2.8 million people, the experience of being able to walk down the street and nobody knows anything about you, that anonymity can feel like freedom, or it did to me. So that was also something kind of interesting and joyful that I wanted to write about. And then in the Glass Hotel, I've stayed in a ton of hotels, as you have as a travel writer. I've done so much travel for Station 11. And sometimes when you're in the Best Western by the expressway in, some random state, you find yourself thinking about what would my ideal hotel be? If I could transport myself into some kind of magical hotel that was exactly what I want a hotel to be. And the Glass Hotel is sort of my ideal dream vision hotel. The hotel that almost exists outside of time and space. You feel like it's its own self-enclosed world. It's incredibly beautiful. And I thought it would just be kind of interesting to put a place like that in an absolutely incongruous location. So the hotel is completely fictional. The location actually is real. I just changed the name. Quatsino, British Columbia, is a hamlet of, I want to say, 85 people. It's located deep in an inlet at the far northern end of Vancouver Island. To get there, you drive to the northernmost point of Vancouver Island. You kind of maneuver around on dirt roads for a while. You get to the end of roads at the village of Cole Harbor. And at that point, you take a water taxi to Quatsino. So it's the most remote place I've ever been to. I spent a couple of weeks there when I was 14. And I think I loved the incongruity and sense of magic in setting a hotel like that in a place like Quatsino.
And I think it offers that really interesting intersection between money and, the shadow country of the working class, because you have this hotel that is owned by this very wealthy mogul, AKA thief, and then there's the people who labor at the hotel. And so it just offered these sort of like intersecting universes that were quite intriguing.
Yeah. Yeah. Hotels are really useful for fiction writers because that's a place where you can very plausibly get a lot of people from very different backgrounds and geographies together. So, you can have a Vincent cross paths with a Leon and a Jonathan at the bar. So, yeah, we were talking about the technical aspects of writing, and there is absolutely, I find hotels very useful from that standpoint.
Oh, interesting. Well, you also, both novels in a significant way feature shipping. The Glass Hotel more than the first, but I was interested in shipping. How does one settle on shipping as narrative device? Container ship, not sailboats, but container shipping.
Yeah. It seems not to be a common interest. This comes up a lot. I think it's the combination of scale and invisibility that I find interesting. We don't think about shipping because we don't have to. The stuff around us just kind of arrives on schedule. We don't really think about the fact that our desk lamp was transported over an ocean, let alone thinking of the people who transported it. I read a book on the subject once that I really loved called 90% of Everything. And that pretty much summed up the situation. So few things are made on this continent at this point. So almost everything on and around us came to us over the ocean. And I think it's just the fact that it's an incredibly vast part of our economy and part of our world that somehow manages to be oddly invisible. I think that's what interests me. And then also the condition of people working between countries. I'm interested in work as a topic, and they live very precarious lives, I have to say. If you disappear from a container ship in international waters, you're kind of outside of anybody's jurisdiction. Suppose it's flagged to Panama. That means that legally it's a tiny floating place, a tiny floating piece of Panamanian territory. But is Panama going to investigate the disappearance of a non-Panamanian national in international waters? Probably not. So it's kind of fascinating to me as a frontier to the international oceans that that there are all of these thousands or hundreds of thousands of people working really between countries.
Yeah, there are these liminal spaces, neither one place or the next. Also, if you are back in Los Angeles, I highly recommend a tour down to our port. It is the largest shipping container port in the Western Hemisphere. So
that would be cool to see.
It actually is really, driving around, the scale of it is really intense. And during the pandemic, there has been, a lot of something you describe in Station 11, which is these ships kind of caught offshore because they aren't able to disembark. That has been happening here in LA because of, not wanting to create any opportunities for the disease to spread. But the scale of it, the abstractness, when you're driving through those docks and seeing the size of them and the size of the containers and the mountains of containers, there is something really kind of mind-boggling.
It's just so inhuman. It has nothing to do with us. It's sort of like world machinery.
Exactly. There is something a little terrifying about it. So I wanted to go back to your career path as a writer, because, you have not followed the cookie cutter career path of, undergrad and maybe English or lit, followed by an MFA at some nice writing program somewhere. I'm very into this. I'm an art and architecture writer who studied neither art nor architecture, so I'm all for doing things that you in no way studied.
Right.
And so I'd love to know how that has, what has been your writing education? How has the process of your, I understand you studied dance. How has that shaped sort of your worldview as a writer?
Right. Yeah, it's a weird trajectory.
Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah, I was homeschooled when I was a kid, as that was just kind of the sort of counterculture, sort of hippie thing to do when I was growing up. My dad's actually from Southern California and from Ventura County. Yeah, so he immigrated to Canada not long before I was born, and I was raised by hippies on Vancouver Island. So keeping kids home from school was just kind of like the sort of back to the land thing in that moment. Um, so I was homeschooled until I was 15. And there was a period of time when one of the very few requirements of the curriculum was that I had to write something every day. So that got me in the habit of writing from a really early age. And to be clear, I don't mean to imply that it was good, like it was, poems about daffodils and cats, the deep concerns of 8-year-olds. Um, but it was something that I loved, and it was something I kept doing, even though I was really dead set on becoming a dancer. That was my absolute focus as a child and until my early 20s. So I trained in ballet. It was 6 days a week by the time I was 13. There was a really good dance school not that far from us on Vancouver Island. And then when I was 18, I auditioned successfully for the School of Toronto Dance Theatre, which is a conservatory program in contemporary dance. And yeah, I don't know what happened with dance. I just kind of fell out of love with it. There was a moment when I was about, I want to say 21, 22. I'd graduated from this dance program and danced for a couple of independent choreographers. And I just had this realization, like, wait a minute, I don't actually enjoy this anymore. It felt like much more of a chore than a joy, which kind of raised the obvious question, which was, now what? That was a non-degree granting program in contemporary dance. I'd done a couple of semesters of community college, but I had no degrees or diplomas from anywhere, including high school. Um, so I just decided to take the writing more seriously. At the time, I was living in Montreal and I was working this warehouse job, which was actually fine. It gave me a lot of time to write, but I had to meet a truck at 7 a.m. to unload boxes, which I have to tell you was kind of rough in Montreal in the wintertime. It was minus 20 Celsius, which is not that far off Fahrenheit. Like, it's just way too cold is the headline there. So that wasn't something I wanted to do forever. Yeah, I was trying to figure out what the direction of my life was going to be and just started to take the writing more seriously. And it was a gradual transition of going from thinking of myself as a dancer who wrote as a hobby to thinking of myself as a writer who still went to the occasional dance audition to just really committing absolutely to the writing and just doing that. And it was around that time in my early 20s that I began writing what eventually became my first novel, Last Night in Montreal. So yeah, it was a weird trajectory. I've never studied writing in any way. I've had a couple of teaching opportunities, and the truth is, I have no idea how to teach writing or like how it's done. So yeah, I'm totally unqualified for something like that. And in terms of how it's shaped me and my work, there is a really intense discipline that you get in dance, which I think would carry over not just to a different branch of the arts, but to anything. I think if you've been a dancer, maybe that makes you a more disciplined attorney, or whatever it is that you end up doing after dance. I have to say too that dance is a much harder career than writing in a lot of ways. Writers like to complain about how hard the writing life can be. And it's not always super easy, but if you blow out your knee, you can still be a writer. And that's not true of dancers. So yeah, it's good preparation.
Writers tend to blow out their livers. That's
yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I interviewed a couple years back a painter who had been a dancer, and she articulated some of those same ideas, that sense of getting up, the rehearsal, the training, the sort of deeply introspective focus on your body created like a discipline that she felt she would have otherwise not had.
Right. Yeah.
Is that sort of like very internal aspect? You see something, is that something you see materializing in your characters?
I think so. Yeah. I need to think about that more, but that rings true to me.
So I wanted to go back quickly to Station 11 because one of the things I was very intrigued about, first of all, you have a character called Miranda Carroll, and I have a friend named Miranda Carroll. So shout out from Miranda Carroll, who is the publicist at the Gallery of New South Wales in Australia.
That's wonderful. And I feel like your name is very Miranda Carroll-like. Like it's just kind of...
Yeah, Miranda Carroll used to actually live in LA, and we would get each other's emails. So I'm on that vibe.
Right.
But I was very intrigued by the comic book in Station 11, from which the novel takes its name, Station 11, that Miranda creates. And so I wanted to get a sense, like, are you a comic book reader? How did you conceive of that? I mean, there are some very, very specific descriptions of the artwork in the comic books, how they're created, her creating this apparition, and she's not satisfied with the initial versions of it, so she recreates it several times. And so, yeah, tell me a little bit about your comic book process for this novel.
Yeah, sure. It was not terribly extensive, I have to say. I was just sort of imagining what it would be like to be a comic book artist. I really like graphic novels and graphic memoirs, actually. I don't read a ton of memoirs, but I really like graphic memoirs as a genre. I love Alison Bechdel's work. There was a graphic memoir I read a few years ago called Blankets by, I think the author's name was Craig Thompson, that was just gorgeous. So it's a form that I'm really interested in that I wouldn't say that I know a lot about. I'm definitely more of a fan than an expert. But in thinking about the Dr. 11 comic books, there were a couple of visual touchstones for me. One was the first graphic novel I ever read, which was a collaboration that Neil Gaiman did with an artist, part of the Sandman series. It was called Brief Lives. It was just the most beautiful book. It's the way I remember it, I haven't read it in a while, is this kind of wash of watercolors with thick kind of ink lines. And yeah, it was visually stunning. I was thinking of that. I was also thinking about Calvin and Hobbes, the Spaceman Spiff panels, which were funny, but also they were beautiful. That alien landscape, a kind of wash of orange and pink and two moons on the horizon and like pale blue fading out into indigo. It was just visually stunning. So yeah, I was thinking about those two things when I was imagining what the Dr. 11 comic books looked like.
I was intrigued, not just by that, but by the fact that both novels in some ways feature works of art and culture in these very significant ways. So the comic book in Station 11, the Shakespeare theater troupe, the thinking about theater and music and classical music and its significance in the Glass Hotel, its painting. And thinking about painting, like, well, this seems like something that you come to in your book, sort of this idea of these cultural artifacts and their meaning and significance. I guess what are some of the cultural artifacts that have meaning and significance for you? I mean, in coming up as a writer, what are some of the books that not necessarily influenced you, but that you think that maybe shaped you or motivated you, or the other works of art that in some way kind of made you who you are?
There are a few. Michael Ondaatje, if you grow up in Canada, he's canon, everybody reads him. His novel, The English Patient, which I read when I was about 14. And it's one of those books that I'm afraid to go back to because I'm afraid it won't be as beautiful as I remember it. I already loved writing by the time I was a teenager, but I think of that as the book that showed me how beautiful prose can be. So that book's been incredibly important to me. Another book, and I get some funny looks around this one, Norman Mailer's novel, The Executioner's Song. For me, Mailer is another one of these writers like Philip Roth, where a little bit hit or miss. I definitely don't like a lot of Mailer's books that I've read, but I love The Executioner's Song. And I think the moment when I read it was really important. I'd just written my first novel, Last Night in Montreal, which, I don't know, I hope it wasn't too fussy, but I think there's a trap you can fall into as a young writer where you know that you have a degree of talent to this thing, and you can kind of fall into this trap of making all of your sentences as pretty as possible. And things can get a little bit ornate in a way that can get a little bit precious. So I would describe Last Night in Montreal that way. So after writing that book, while I was just beginning my next book, I read The Executioner's Song, and the prose is just so clear and simple and lucid in a way that's really hard. The kind of prose that looks easy, but is incredibly difficult to pull off. And there was just something so revelatory to me in the idea of prose that was so pared down. I just loved that. So I think that book had a profound influence on the way I write. Yeah, so I would point to those two in particular.
That's really interesting. I wouldn't have guessed Mailer was, but that stripped down language, there is something really remarkable, something a little hard boiled, and also a little tabloid about it, about being able to tell a story in such a short amount of space. And it's this type of writing that can be overlooked, but incredibly powerful.
Yeah, it has that kind of writing has a real velocity to it, which I love. That's one of my core values as a writer is, how fast can I make this book move? What can I pare away to make it move faster? Sometimes you'll read novels that are really beautifully written and have a lot of substance and wonderful things about them, but you're kind of going through pages of exposition. And yeah, so I'm always trying to make it as streamlined as possible.
So you have these overlapping characters in Station 11 and the Glass Hotel. Are any of these characters you're planning on revisiting again in any other books?
I don't know. Like, how many alternate universes can you put Miranda and Leon in before the whole thing kind of falls apart? Yeah, for me, that's what it came down to. Was just really liking those characters. When I wrote Station 11, I really enjoyed writing Miranda. I really liked Leon too, even though by the final draft of Station 11, he's a very minor character. It's basically a cameo appearance. But he is, of course, a major character in the Glass Hotel. So I knew I wanted to reuse Miranda in the next book, which presented kind of an obvious problem, which maybe I won't give any crazy spoilers of Station 11, but yeah, you'll know what I'm talking about if you've read it. There were obvious reasons why it was hard to use her again. So I tried to lay the groundwork for the idea of alternate universes in Station 11, where I have a couple of characters in a post-apocalyptic chapter, just kind of riffing on the idea of an alternate universe where maybe that pandemic hadn't happened. And then the mirror of that is Vincent in the Glass Hotel, wandering the streets of Manhattan, playing this game that she plays with herself, where she just kind of idly thinks through, counter lives, so different permutations of reality. Including, for example, a permutation where that terrifying new flu hadn't been quite so swiftly contained. So, yeah, I was trying to lay the groundwork for the idea of alternate universes there so that I could use those characters again. I know that that wasn't clear to everybody. I got a really lovely review recently that I really appreciated, but the reviewer talked about how the Glass Hotel was obviously set in the months right before Station 11. So I know some people will read the Glass Hotel waiting for a pandemic. But the Glass Hotel is 100% pandemic free. That's a major selling point of the book.
I know you have said, actually, I think to the LA Times, that you can't imagine anybody wanting to read a pandemic book right now. But I have to be honest, it's a really great read, and it is so interesting how much not about a pandemic it is, because it is in these. A lot of it takes place 20 years out. So if you are wary about flu pandemic books, I say put that worry aside and just read it. So I wanted to, this is the last question, and then I know we have a bunch of reader questions coming in. I know that Station 11 is being made into HBO miniseries starring Gael Garcia Bernal, who I'm personally kind of into, so I'm very excited about this. I have to subscribe to HBO. So I'd love to know where that stands. Have you had any looks at what this is going to look like, how it fits with your vision? Like, what's been your involvement with all of this?
I have no official involvement with the project, which is kind of wonderful. Like I love that there's no pressure and I can just sit back and watch it as an audience member when it comes out. Yeah, so I really don't have any inside scoop about it, but I can't
So
wait
there's
to
been
see
no
it.
set visits. You haven't been able to.
No, I probably could have talked my way onto the set, but the set was in Chicago in January, and I'm usually not a delicate flower with the weather. Like I did live in Montreal, but it's hard to get really excited about Chicago in January. I'm hoping that when the world starts up again and filming resumes, that I'll get to visit another set. I would love to see what the traveling symphony looks like. See those caravans. But yeah, I haven't visited a set yet.
Yeah, and what that comic book looks like. And
yeah, that'd be cool to see.
World will look like 20 years after this very intense flu. Emily, I can't thank you enough. This was fantastic. I had such a good time reading your books. I am going to pass the baton back to Donna, who I know has lots of questions from readers about your books. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. That was fascinating. And I'm glad Carolina got to ask you about those Emily bombs, because as she's been reading both books, she keeps talking about them. So we've been sharing stories and both enjoying your books. Fortunately, Carolina asked a few of the questions that our readers had as well, like recurring characters. But I do have quite a few other questions for you. And the first one is, the motto of the Traveling Symphony is because survival is insufficient. How did you decide to inject Star Trek and the character Seven of Nine into your book's Shakespearean truth?
You just can't predict what random piece of pop culture will stay in your head forever. But when I was 19 or 20, I saw an episode of Star Trek Voyager where Seven of Nine says survival is insufficient. And it struck me then, and it still strikes me now, as just the most elegant expression of something I believe to be true, which is that, of course, survival isn't enough. That's why we have Shakespearean theater companies. That's why we have books. That's why we have newspapers. We always long as a species for something more than just the basics of food, water, and shelter. And I feel like that's what makes us human. So yeah, as I began writing Station 11 and thinking more about the symphony, it just seemed like a very natural motto for them. It's the sort of statement of why they exist, which is painted rather defensively on the side of the caravan. But it was also it was almost a thesis statement of the entire book for me.
Well, thank you. Another reader named Kristen would like to know, what drew you to speculative fiction, and what do you feel that speculative fiction can do then that realistic fiction can't pull off? What's your take on that?
There's a lot of freedom in speculative fiction. I'm by no means an expert in the history, but I had an interesting conversation with somebody a few years ago about the role that speculative fiction had played in communist Poland, where it was possible to make political statements in speculative fiction that you absolutely could not make in a more straightforward way. I've been reading an anthology that's really interesting called Broken Stars, translated by Ken Liu. It's a great book. It's an anthology of contemporary Chinese science fiction. And he makes the argument for a few of the pieces in the book that the writers, some of whom are using pseudonyms, are saying things about Chinese society that they could not say in again, in a more straightforward way. So I think it absolutely plays an interesting role there. In terms of what drew me to it, my original idea with Station 11 was that it was going to be set entirely in the present day. I wanted to write about the lives of people who were devoted to their art. So it was just going to be about this traveling Shakespearean theater company in present day Canada. But at the same time, I really wanted to write about technology, which, it feels different saying these things now in this moment when I can't get on an airplane. But this world where, I could theoretically cross the Atlantic Ocean in 5 hours, where we have these devices that we hold in our pockets, which hold all of human knowledge, by means of which we can talk to people. The way we call those phones, when really they're supercomputers. So I was interested in writing about those things and the kind of, more broadly speaking, the apparatus of modern civilization, the modern medicine, dentistry, all these things that we take for granted, right down to electricity and running water. And it seemed to me that an interesting way to write about those things might be to contemplate their absence. So the question of Station 11 was, what does the world look like if all of those things were to fall very suddenly away? And yeah, so that's to say that I wasn't interested in writing about the future per se. It was more that I wanted to explore the idea of a world with no technology. So maybe it's fair to say that I fell into speculative fiction a little bit by accident in that regard. I certainly didn't set out to write a speculative novel. Although I did read a ton of speculative fiction and sci-fi, when I was a kid and a teenager. And those reading experiences were really important.
Another one of our readers would like to know, do you envision a sequel to Station 11?
Absolutely not. There's no Station 12. Although sometimes I imagine in some sort of magical future where I have more time, collaborating with a graphic artist to make the Dr. 11 comic books happen. So that would be a continuation of a kind. I don't know if it will ever happen. It's been hard to find the time, but I love the idea.
And in Douglas Adams's Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, readers learn about the pan-galactic gargle blaster, the best drink. It's the book calls it the best drink in existence. Do you have a favorite end of the world cocktail?
I am the only writer in the entire world who doesn't drink. I can recommend really good coffees, but yeah, I am useless with cocktails.
That sounds great. And I think we just had one other question. Can you tell us what's behind the reference in Station 11 to the passage? That comes from a reader named Marissa. And,
oh, yeah. That's just a book I really liked, The Passage by Justin Cronin. I feel like, excuse me, none of these disasters happen in a vacuum. In our current moment with this pandemic, we're of course thinking about past pandemics and fictional pandemics. And it would be the same for the characters in Station 11. So, what I was imagining is if I were stranded in that airport, kind of stuck there as it became increasingly obvious that civilization had ground to a halt, I might find myself thinking about other disastrous civilization annihilating scenarios that I'd read about and thinking, well, you know what? It could be worse. Like, at least there are no vampires. I think that's the thought that would cross my mind. So, yeah, I just put that idea into a character. Yeah, in the passage, the world ends because of vampires. It's way worse.
So when we do our usual live book events, we always have a bookseller on site so people could get signed books. In this case, we couldn't do it, but we partnered with Romans, and you were nice enough to sign some book plates. So they have a limited number of books available. If anyone would like a commemorative book from our book club, they have both books there, and I wanted to mention that. I also wanted to mention that I invite our readers to sign up for our LA Times Book Club newsletter so that people can stay in the loop. We write about our events, we have our conversations, and we'll have a report, share a video from tonight's book club. I want to thank you both. What a fascinating conversation. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Carolina.
Thanks you so
for
much.
having me.
I always like to say sometimes we don't ask a question that maybe or something you want to share. So I always like to give our writers the last word, something they'd like to share. Carolina, do you have a last word to share with our readers or something you'd like to mention from this evening?
I'm on my next pandemic novel, which, believe it or not, I had never read, which is Albert Camus' The Plague. And I am just starting it, but it's really interesting. The chapter I just finished is all about the state of disbelief about what is happening as rats pile up everywhere. So I just think that is a really interesting piece of human psychology to think about in this moment.
Okay.
I just read that. Yeah, I mean, as my closing statement, I'm just going to say, wear your masks. Like, seriously. Yeah, that's it.
Well, thank you both. And thank you to all of our readers for joining us tonight. We had quite a few more questions, but you guys were so thorough that Carolina covered quite a few of them. So thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.